This is a story from a couple of years back with a few friends of mine. I'll tell this experience the best I can, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. Now, I'm an avid hiker, camper, and hitchhiker. I've stayed in almost every wooded area in California in my early 20s, and I love staying in the woods for long periods. I know the Trinity National Forest like the back of my hand and feel very comfortable going out with practically nothing but a fishing rod and a couple of knives, as there's food and water everywhere for those who know the ins and outs. Anyway, my friends Andrea and Mario wanted to do an overnight trip to the Tahoe National Forest to Lake Tahoe. Mario was a professional photographer and enjoyed taking cool pictures of the castle on the island there. We arrived a day early in my 2002 Jeep Grand Cherokee because we wanted to sleep in the Jeep in the woods somewhere beforehand. It was my idea, and I know it sounds weird, 3 people sleeping in a Jeep, but there was enough room and we all didn't really mind. I was filled with curiosity and paranoia, all while having an explosive amount of fun when we arrived in the forest because it was new territory to me. But that was just it, new territory. I was careful and excited because I didn't know what animals or creatures called this place home. I'm fascinated by things like cryptids and was well aware of their different homelands. But the Tahoe National Forest was never really on my radar for research. I was there to see and explore while they did the whole picture thing. After all, I've never really heard anything crazy happening here. So there we were, arriving in the town but going farther out of the city limit into the woods until I saw a dirt road. The sun was setting, and it was perfect because we were tired and wanted to park somewhere remote, set up our bed, smoke, chill, and sleep. So we were driving down the road for about 20 minutes. The road kept getting more edgy and bumpy, but it wouldn't end. After about 30 minutes, our phones were out of service, and I had to put my Jeep into 4-wheel drive. Now it's dark out, and we still are not seeing the end of this road. I reassured Mario and Andrea that we would be fine once we saw a clearing, and I would just park on the side and we would relax. After about 40 minutes of driving down this dirt road, BSing, laughing, and four-wheeling in the dark with high beams, going through creeks, inclines, and whatever else, we arrived at this little circle clearing on the side of this now non-existent dirt road. We parked where it was level and proceeded to stretch out, continuing to laugh and joke, load bowls, and eat. I was setting up the bed in the back of the Jeep, and Mario and Andrea were just vibing and looking at the trees and the moss. We all had headlamps on our heads. I could tell it would be a new moon, as it was essentially pitch black. It was around 11:30 p.m. when we started rubbing our eyes and calling it a night. We all got in the Jeep and tried to get some shut-eye while listening to a podcast. I fell asleep but awoke to the sound of some branches snapping outside. It was a hot night, so I cracked my windows for airflow before bed, which made us susceptible to the outside ambience. In a quiet voice, I asked if anyone was awake. Being inches apart from each other, they both said, "What the hell was that?" After entertaining crazy thoughts about what it could be, I looked at the clock and it was only around 1 a.m. We then fell back asleep but woke up again for what I could consider no reason. My mind was still on edge, so I was sleeping very lightly. I looked at Mario, who was on his phone playing games. I asked him what time it was. He said, 2:39. Then I asked if he wanted to go on a walk and try to get a night exposure photo with his camera, and he immediately said yes. Andrea awoke at that moment and asked what we were doing as we opened up the back hatch and dressed. We told her we were going for a walk as I grabbed my quiver of arrows and crossbow for protection. Don't ask me why, I was feeling brave, and he grabbed his camera and tripod for the pictures. At that moment, we heard a bunch of coyotes howling, and she looked at us and said, "You guys are stupid. Give me the car keys in case you don't come back," putting a pillow over her face and going back to sleep. We got on our headlights, and I put a red light on my Jeep to avoid losing sight of it. Then I started walking into the dense forest. We didn't talk much. We just enjoyed the night air and the sounds of owls and night critters scurrying around. The forest was so alive, and we were so in tune with the night. It was almost fantasy. Among the sounds of the forest, after walking for about 15 minutes or so, looking for a clearing to take photos of the sky, we heard a soft creek flowing nearby and tried to follow it. I looked back and didn't even see the red light of my Jeep, but I didn't mind because I knew where we were going. Lost in thought, I bumped into Mario as he stood still. I ran into him like a brick wall. He whispered, "Shut up and listen. You hear only the creek?" I paused and held my breath. There was no wind in the environment. No insects. No birds. I had never heard more silence in my life. I could even feel my hair standing on edge as we both peered around with our headlamps, trying to capture anything we could to direct our attention to, other than the mere silence of the situation. That's when I saw it. A singular eye reflected off our headlamps about 40 feet to the side, gazing at us from behind a tree. It was as if this thing was trying to spy on us because it was behind a tree. In the Tahoe National Forest, giant pine trees and sequoia surrounded us. Some of the tree branches didn't even start until 12 or 14 feet off the ground, and this thing was standing about 7 or 8 feet tall, judging by where its eyeball was. I turned my headlamp off, put an arrow in my crossbow, and drew the string as quietly and slowly as possible. I told Mario to shut his light off, but he was so frozen in awe of what this creature was doing, or going to do, that he had absolutely no response. I aimed the crossbow at the tree where this thing was standing, and I saw its head fully come out from behind it, with both eyes now reflecting yellow. It was just out of range of our headlights, so the figure was too dark to make out except for the massive body and eyes. It looked like it had no fur and a huge, round, skull-shaped head. I turned on my headlamp, and this creature stepped out from behind the tree. From the figure's silhouette, I could see this thing's hands swaying below its knee area. That was it for me. I let an arrow fly toward the figure, and with a thump, this thing jumped 3 feet out of the way as my arrow hit the tree. It got on all fours and sprinted out of there into the dark night toward where the creek was, where we were headed. Mario looked at me with watery eyes from keeping them fixated for so long. "What the heck was that?" he said. I didn't know. I grabbed his shirt and tugged him to follow me, and we walked backward the way we came. I was shuddering with fear, but none of it showed. Whatever that thing was, I don't know. A million thoughts raced through my mind as I pulled another arrow out of my quiver and strapped it into my chamber. I drew the string as I walked behind Mario. We were both strolling on edge, and soon I saw the red light in the distance that was on top of my Jeep. I pointed it out, and we started moving hastily toward it. It's the most annoying thing that my Jeep's alarm system wants to go off every time someone opens the door unless the key fob is clicked. I was going to wake Andrea up by knocking on the window and telling her to press the key fob button, but it was too late. My Jeep was wailing like a cryptid, and there was a damn cryptid among us. Lights were flashing, and everyone was in a panic. I yelled at Mario to get in the car, asked Andrea to be quiet, and handed me the keys. We slammed the doors, and I locked them. I started my Jeep and shoved it into drive, but before we could start moving, a tree branch fell from above us and broke out my back window. Now, absolutely scared crapless, I peeled off down the barely noticeable dirt road, nearly flipping my Jeep because of the incline. Now at a decline, with the bumpiness of the road, I flicked on my high beams and a 360-degree light bar that I have, so the forest was lit up in a 200-foot radius. As I was driving near 25 miles an hour, I told Andrea to grab my crossbow and keep it aimed out of the shattered back window. I've trained her to use it pretty well, but I've never actually had her shoot anything that might be living. I'm flooring it now because we're on a tiny straightaway, and I told everyone to stay silent and focus on making it past the tree line. I swear, at the moment before we were about to break free, we heard this deafening but distant roar. It sounded like a mix between a human and an eagle screaming and yelling. I tried to pinpoint the sound in my mind and realized the cryptid was no longer chasing us. I told Andrea to let the arrow loose and put the crossbow away. I slowed, driving more carefully on this terrible road, but still hurrying out. We eventually got somewhere that I felt safe. We ordered some food and told every waiter and waitress what we encountered. The cook that came out had a similar story from the same neck of the woods. We all bonded over surviving, ate our food, drove to a vista point overlooking Lake Tahoe, and proceeded to remake our bed. Eventually, we all fell back asleep around 5 a.m. We woke up at around 8 o'clock, rented some kayaks, and had a fantastic day taking pictures and drinking beers. In the ancient embrace of the Appalachian Mountains, long-forgotten secrets and dangers linger in the shadows of the forest. Amidst those woods, my family fell prey to an entity creeping from the depths, enveloping our secluded home nestled at the mountain's base. in a hollow at the end of a long gravel road. Our 50-acre farm, abandoned for decades, whispered promises of opportunity to my father. A seemingly low price blinded him to the dormant malevolence veiled within. Once a good man and a devoted father, he often held a camera, joyfully documenting our lives. He envisioned building a life for us in the secluded place, celebrating birthdays, first steps, graduations, and everything else life has to offer. The initial joy captured in old family videos gradually surrendered to a sinister transformation. Time unfurled this change slowly as my once vibrant father succumbed to an unseen force. He engaged less and less, spiraling into depression and becoming abusive, perpetuating a cycle of failure and despair. Whatever the land belonged to must have been as dormant as the land was forgotten. Minor accidents and expenses marked the beginning. Drinking increased, but it was never enough. He lost his job, the double-wide trailer was repossessed, pushing him into selling drugs. As I watched, black shadows, snake-like tendrils with oozing black miasma, surrounded him. Few at first, they multiplied as circumstances worsened. Fear of my loud, angry father transformed into a dread of the evil shadows that trailed him. As time progressed, I found myself avoiding my father, spending less and less time in his presence. The insidious whispers grew louder whenever he was near, hurling malicious and hurtful words at him. Labels of worthlessness, uselessness, and failure. I questioned why no one else seemed aware of these haunting voices, feeling a chilling isolation that deepened my fear. Once a haven for other families, our dwelling now stood as a dilapidated shell, barely a barrier against the elements. Divided into 2 rooms, one served as a makeshift living room, and the other a communal bedroom for our family of 6. The kitchen lacked an exterior wall, replaced by a feeble plastic sheet, while the bathroom housed a barely functioning toilet. It was too small for our family, but it was what we had. In this deteriorating trailer, my father reached rock bottom. His once attainable dream of providing a better life for his family had now transformed into a haunting failure. The relentless whispers urged him to believe that our lives would improve without him, that his absence would lead us out of the suffocating existence he thought he had caused. One scorching summer night, I believe I was about 7 years old, the shadows reached their crescendo. My parents were arguing once again, this time worse than ever. His rage, fueled by fear and regret, permeated the atmosphere. My siblings and I sat on the couch, and as the youngest, I sat on my eldest sister's lap. The screaming and crying coming from the other room grew louder and closer. As my dad entered the room, so did the whispering shadows. My dad revealed the gun. The screaming stopped, and the room went deathly quiet. All except the whispers, they grew louder and more consistent. Do it. Do it. No one will miss you. You're worthless anyway. Just do it. Sullen but calm, my father walked away from where he stood in front of my mother and sat in his chair. I watched him say, "Sorry," as tears fell down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry for everything." His hands stilled with resolve as they clasped the gun. He raised it, put it in his mouth. The only sound I heard were the whispers. I felt my sister's hands over my eyes and saw nothing but black. An explosion, the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life, etched into my memory to this day. The shadows retreated, satisfied by the spilled blood, but our scars lingered. My father survived what should have been a fatal gunshot wound. Had the angle been slightly different, he wouldn't have made it. The aftermath saw him seeking help, and our family escaped the property. Yet the haunting specter of that night endured. My father never returned to the man he was before. He wasn't the man the shadows caused him to be either. We kept the property but have never gone back. As time passed, the shadows seemed like a young child's imagination trying to make sense of a traumatic experience. Now, in my late 20s, I've saved up and purchased a motorhome. I plan on saving more, now that I'm not paying rent. I want to travel. I moved back to that property. It was a free parking spot until my travel fund was reached. Even if it held some horrible memories, that's all they were. At least that's what I thought. I've been living here for 6 months now. When I saw the shadows, they anchored me to the land. It's all happening much more quickly than with my father. I don't know if I'm more susceptible because I can see them and hear them. Maybe I'm just weaker than he was. Either way, I can't leave or ask for help. No one would care. I'm writing this all down because I don't know how long I can fight it. The gun. It's beside me now on the table, and I don't know if I'll make it out alive. Not like my father. This story is not one that involves a near-death experience, but to this day, I still cannot explain what I saw. For context, I'm a 6-foot-tall, 150 pounds male in my early 20s who is an avid outdoor enthusiast. I've been hiking and backpacking for well over a decade and enjoy rock climbing and mountaineering. I spent about 7 years in search and rescue and have some stories from my experience, but nothing creepy or unexplainable from my time there. Anyways, I've spent a fair amount of time outdoors and over the past year had taken up solo hiking and backpacking. Normally, I would try to go with some friends, but I honestly enjoyed the solitude and self-reliance. I often neglected even asking my friends to go unless I absolutely needed more people. On a rainy November day, I decided to go hiking up to Green Mountain Lookout in the Cascade mountain range of Washington State. I intended on spending the night there in the Old Fire Lookout. I checked the map, and the trailhead is rather remote by Washington standards, involving something like 26 miles of driving on a partially paved Old Forest Service road. I drove up the road and was surprised to see just one other vehicle there. To call it a parking lot would be an overstatement. It was just a wide spot on the road that could fit maybe 6 vehicles in total. The road meandered past the parking area, around a curve, and out of sight. While it was a weekend, the weather was rather foul, and above 5,000 feet, the rain would be turning to snow. So, I was not expecting to see other people. I parked and opened my door, starting to get my pack ready. There was a light drizzle already, and I noticed how quiet the woods were. Normally, there's a fair amount of ambient noise in any forest. The only sound I could hear was the water dripping off the leaves and trees. I chalked it up to being late fall. Most of the birds had likely migrated to warmer climates. The bugs were probably hiding due to the rain, and it was daytime, so other animals would be seeking shelter from the elements or sleeping after a night of foraging. I started hiking and was enjoying the gradual uphill climb of the trail. Because of my time in search and rescue, I enjoy tracking. Anytime I'm on a trail, I usually face the ground and track other hikers or animals to keep my skills sharp. I noticed there were 2 sets of tracks, one larger, one smaller, both in running shoes. After the first mile or so, the trail leaves the confines of the Douglas fir and western hemlock forest, opening up to lush, green alpine meadows. In summer, these meadows bloom with vibrant wildflowers, but in late fall, they were just green with the dying brown stalks of once beautiful plants. Right at the edge of the meadows, I met the 2 hikers, a man and a woman coming down. As is customary on the West Coast, we swapped trail condition information. I gave them a once-over and noticed they both had trail runners on. They told me it got snowy past the first section of the meadows and had started snowing around 3 a.m. They mentioned they had the trail to themselves, which made sense. There were no berries to attract bears this time of year. We wished each other well, and I continued on. The trail opened to a beautiful valley flanked by meadows, forests, and towering mountains. On clear days, you can see Glacier Peak to the south. The trail switchbacks up the meadows and through a few patches of trees. I hiked up another 1.5 miles or so before I reached the snow level. Just as predicted, it was the first snow of the season, and the snow level was about 5,000 feet. As I continued hiking, I noticed more tracks in the fresh snow. There were 2 sets. One was from an exceptionally large dog, maybe a Mastiff or Bernese Mountain Dog given the size, and the second set was from a pair of large hiking boots, probably around size 15 or larger. Normally, I wouldn't care about these tracks, but something didn't add up. First, there was only one other vehicle in the parking lot. Second, I hadn't noticed these tracks in the mud earlier, and surely I would have. And third, how did these prints just appear halfway up the trail? There are no trails that intersect with this one on the backside of Green Mountain. It's a remote area. Could have been a hunter, but that seemed unlikely given the difficult access and the fact that the other hikers said they had been alone. All of this was giving me a weird feeling. The forest was still eerily quiet. Strange tracks were there that shouldn't be. It was snowing, wet, cold, and I realized I couldn't stay overnight in the old lookout because it was locked. The aura of the area felt ominous. I listened to my gut instinct and decided to head back to my car. I hiked down about a mile and was on the last of the switchbacks before the trail re-enters the forest when something caught my eye. I stopped, looking down into the alpine meadow, and saw something about 1,000 vertical feet below me, less than a kilometer away. I squinted and saw a pure white shape in the meadow. At first, I thought it was one of those Inuksuq statues from the 2010 Winter Olympics resembling a man. All I could see was the head and shoulders, the rest obscured by the underbrush. It was standing on a 40-degree slope. The more I stared at it, the more confused I became. Couldn't be snow on a tree since this was the first snow of the season, and the snow line was still much higher up. Could it have been a sun-bleached tree stump? But that seemed unlikely, given that this spot was an alpine meadow, not a logged area. Given the size of the thing, it would have had to be at least 10 feet tall to appear that large from my distance. I shuffled in my pocket to put on my gloves, and when I looked back, the thing had moved, just slightly. I could now make out 2 black spots where eyes would be and a black slit where a mouth might be. I freaked out. In the minute I'd been watching it, it hadn't moved, and now, in the 5 seconds I looked away, it seemed to be looking right at me. Chills ran down my back. What the hell was this thing? It was still a half-mile away, but I was over a mile from my car. I felt intensely watched and a growing sense of dread. As there are black bears in the Cascades, I always carry bear spray with me. My only other weapon was a pocket knife buried in my backpack. I unholstered the bear spray and slowly made my way down the trail. I wished I'd brought my .357 Magnum, but it's heavy, and I usually don't justify the weight. At that moment, I felt like a fool for not bringing it. Before I reached the forest, I kept my body facing the area where the thing was. Once inside the forest, the silence returned. No wind, no wildlife. It felt like an apex predator was in the woods, and it wasn't me. My nerves were getting the better of me, and I picked up my pace, jogging downhill toward my car. I was aware that running from a predator could trigger a chase, but I felt like prey, and I didn't like it. I never heard any sounds of pursuit, but I was in full fight or flight mode. After a long 15 minutes, I reached my car, still the only one in the parking area. I threw my backpack into my Subaru, jumped into the driver's seat, and peeled out. I've been stalked by mountain lions, hiked through bear country, and even been shot at by hunters, but none of my previous experiences can compare to the soul-crushing dread I felt when that thing turned to look at me. The following summer, I went back to Green Mountain Lookout. I went to the same spot where I saw that thing, but there was nothing. The meadow was overgrown, and there was no sign of the white shape. I could brush off the feeling of dread as paranoia, but I still cannot rationalize how that white shape was there one day and completely gone 8 months later. That small disparity still gives me chills to this day.